Welcome to the sixth episode of Finding Pieces. In this episode, we're looking at the reasons why pianists make recordings, specifically on piano rolls.
You're listening to Finding Pieces, a podcast on pianos, people, and music.
There are many reasons why we want to record or engage in recorded content, including to capture a memory, share an experience, or record an event. For musicians, recordings are a tool for artistic expression, capturing musical interpretation of one particular moment in time on a device. Today, we're going to explore 5 reasons why pianists would want to record on piano rolls. For those joining this season for their first time and wondering what is a piano roll is a roll of paper which contain perforated holes, and these holes represent music performance data. Piano rolls are inserted into compartments inside a player piano, and the data is read and translates into instructions to play the piano, playing the music that is recorded from these paper rolls. Piano rolls that capture the recording of pianists are played back on player pianos known as reproducing pianos. So, these piano rolls are usually nicknamed according to which reproducing system they play back on. For example, a dual art roll is played back on a dual art reproducing piano. The 5 reasons we're exploring today on why pianists record on piano rolls are for money, how much pianists get paid for recording on piano rolls, for insight, so pianists themselves could hear how they played, for publicity, to disseminate through piano rolls their artistic expressions, for innovation in concert practices involving piano rolls, for legacy, to use piano rolls as teaching resources to teach about how to interpret the music. Making recordings on piano rolls was certainly an alternative source of income for pianists. Classical pianists were paid according to markability. The more famous the pianist, the more he or she was paid. Let's take a look at the following 5 pianists who were under contract with the Hupfeld Company in 1906. The most well paid was Eduard Grieg, who was contracted to make 6 rolls for a payment of 3,000 marks. That's 500 marks per roll. Leopold Godowsky got paid the most amount of money from Hupfeld, 10,000 marks, but he was contracted to do 40 rolls, so his rolls were about 250 each. Frederick Lamont, being a pupil of Liszt, received about 100 marks per roll, and that is about the average amongst Liszt's students. Then there were lesser-known pianists who were only paid 20 or 30 marks per roll, such as Paula Hegner and August Weiss. Another example of pianists being paid by a different player piano company is Ferrucio Busoni. In 1915, Bassoni was initially offered by the Aeolian Company $1,500 to record 2 Bach pieces and 8 Liszt pieces in New York. After negotiations, he accepted $2,500 for 2 Bach, 9 Liszt, and 1 Chopin, as well as $150 per roll for the subsequent 10 titles. In that year, a Bassoni roll would have costed $3.50, which is the top of the range for reproducing piano rolls. It is obvious that the player piano companies were making a profit because, in this case, the Aeolian Company would have had to sell about 700 to 800 of Bassoni's rolls in order to make up the $2,500 that they gave to Bassoni, and possibly quite a lot of profit, which the pianists themselves noticed as well, because in 1920, when Bassoni recorded 10 pieces in London, he was offered 10% royalty on the gross income from his rolls, with £1,000 in advance. Player piano companies were quite tactful in that they contract pianists to record exclusively for them, and not only pianists, but also composers. One of these cases was Igor Stravinsky, who was initially contracted by the Player Company in Paris but this contract was bought out by the Aeolian Company in 1924. According to Robert Croft, Stravinsky's contract with Pleyel was about $2,000 to $4,000 annually. On top of this amount, Stravinsky had an accommodation in the piano factory as well as given his own workshop. So, whatever Pleyel offered Stravinsky, the Aeolian would have offered something higher. The reason why Aeolian was interested in Stravinsky was because A, he was a famous composer, and B, Stravinsky was one of the earlier composers who showed a keen interest in player pianos and the mechanism of how they work. So, one of the pieces he wrote, which is the Etude pour pianola, was specific in its demonstration of the capacities of the player pianos. I will speak a bit more about these compositions in a separate episode. Moving on to the second factor of why pianists would record on piano rolls. Well, recordings are a rediscovery of pianists and how they heard themselves play under performance conditions. As noted by the Aeolian Stewart London recording engineer Reginald Reynolds in his memoirs, there was a real mixture of responses from pianists in the recording studios. One example was Josef Hofmann, who insisted on editing his own recording of the Chopin Concerto in E minor. In Reynolds' words, he, Josef Hofmann, told him that this work had taught him much about his own performance that he would never have discovered in any other ways. Moreover, he declared that it had enabled him to improve his pianoforte playing to a considerable extent. On the other extreme, there was Bassoni, who told Reynolds that in the former days he had been meticulously careful to ensure the accuracy of his technique, but had finally decided that the interpretation was of such superlative importance that he had eased to trouble about the accuracy of the actual notes. How much editing out of wrong notes, or how much to engage in the post-editing of interpretations, was an artistic choice for recording engineers. But this can be increasingly annoying and obvious when constantly reiterated if one was to have the performance on repeat. So, when pianists gave their signature to approve the recording after hearing how their piano rolls are played back, this approval denoted not only a perception of how they think they have played, but also how they would have liked to play. In one sense, piano rolls were sort of a merchandise for composers to further promote their compositions, and more so for pianists to promote their pianistic identity. In those days, and now, if one was a composer, they would publish their composition scores, and if one was a music performer, they would publish their work, their skill, through live performances, giving concerts, or teach. In the 19th century, many of the pianists fulfilled both the composer and pianist roles, but in the early 20th century, there was an increasing influx of pianists who were solely known for being a pianist. Yes, they did some composing and could improvise in concerts, but composing was not the skill that they were primarily known for. And piano rolls became a platform favorable for pianists because this platform promoted and celebrated interpretation more so than creation. There were certainly composer-pianists who recorded and promoted their own works, like Alexander Scriabin or Sergei Rachmaninoff. But many of the pianists were able to be involved by playing existing and familiar classical repertoire. This included works written for the piano, as well as popular orchestral or operatic works, which sometimes the pianists themselves would make arrangements of and record on pianos. Now, the whereabouts of the scores of these arrangements remain a mystery, and so piano rolls became the only documented evidence of this music. so piano rolls were seen in shops as well as on concert platforms. As explored in the previous episode, the Aeolian Company and other player piano companies in the 1920s would commission pianists and musicians to play with piano rolls on their reproducing pianos in concerts. In addition to the accompaniment rolls that contain accompaniment parts for other instrumentalists to play with, there would also be rolls which feature solo piano compositions, where the piano could potentially be left on stage to perform on its own. These rolls not only represented the novelty of the instrument as well as the company, but also represented the pianists themselves. So under these circumstances, I have labeled these roles as being the body double of pianists, like the body double of a main actor or actress. One of the pianists that made use of her body double was the English pianist Myra Hayes in her Aeolian Commission concerts in London. Apparently, after she finished playing the Brahms Rhapsody Opus 119 No. 4, she was asked to do an encore, and to which she returned to the piano, and instead of playing another piece, she played the same rhapsody, but this time using her piano roll. One of the critics, who couldn't see what was going on in the keyboard, asked his neighbor, "Why is she playing the same thing twice?" And this proved, in Reginald Reynolds' words, that the critic had not sensed the substitution of mechanism in place of the musician. And this was true for many of the critics of this time, including Ernest Newman, who confessed that they were unable to tell when the pianist stopped playing and the machine took over. We'll listen to Hayes' recording of the Brahms Rhapsody in just a moment, as this recording feeds very nicely into our discussion of the next and final reason of why pianists record on piano rolls, which is for legacy. That is, piano rolls being educational ventures to teach pupils how to interpret the music. So far, in this episode and throughout the season, we have emphasized on the audio-visual evidence from piano rolls and the mechanical means of how we play and listen to music on them. It is important for us to consider that piano rolls are also visual sources to guide our musical interpretation and music making. Because if we want to explore and fully appreciate the potentials of piano rolls, they should very much be regarded as audio-visual sources. And in a way, that was what the Aeolian Company tried to push forward through their audiographic series. Piano rolls produced under the titles of audiographic would have lengthy word inscriptions as well as the perforations. These inscriptions were usually written by musicologists and occasionally by composers themselves. Myra Hayes' recording of the Brahms Rhapsody was turned into an audiographic roll with a listener's analysis by Nancy Guilford. There is a shortish biographic account of the composer, Johann Brahms, and a bit about those he was acquainted with, in this case, Robert Schumann, a brief explanation of what a rhapsody is, followed by a breakdown analysis of key themes in the tune to listen out for. The music would play for a bit before the next bit of analysis comes along. And this pattern continues. A bit of written explanation, a bit of music, more written explanation, more music, and so on until the piece finishes. There are some variations to the layout in these audiographic rolls. This is another audiographic roll which contained the recording of the first three pieces from Eugene Goosen's composition Kaleidoscope, which is played by the composer himself and has his annotations. The roll embodies a listener's introduction to the music by Percy Scholes. In fact, a very long introduction, first a scheme of the work, then what is modern music, before Goosen's family tree, and finally a bit about Eugene Goosen. There are some nice illustrations between the texts, and this was done by someone called A.J. Tolk. And then, when the music begins, there are running commentaries by the composer, and the piece is played in its entirety without interruptions. I find these commentaries rather amusing and give picturesque narration to the music that not only benefits a listener's point of view, but also helps the pianist's imagination in how they could interpret the piece. The audiographic rolls were extensions from existing dual art recordings, and the extra words on paper were being printed from special printing press, which was an expense undercalculated by the Aeolian Company. The cost of production for these rolls were around £5, and very few people were actually interested in purchasing audiographic rolls, so in the end, these rolls were made at a loss. We have just explored in this episode 5 reasons why pianists would record on piano rolls. We see many evidence pointing to the enthusiasm and advocacy of piano rolls by pianists themselves, as well as the critics and the general public. Sure, we have to look at these evidence with a slight speck of suspicion. Pianists were well paid, so of course they had to say something nice. And concerts were commissioned by player piano companies, and you could say that the audiences were like rent a crowd. The newspaper critics held close association with the player piano companies, so there were hardly any negativism to be found in press. But we cannot deny the fact that player pianos and its piano rolls had once held a dominant place in the music making and music publishing market. And it was a market that any pianist alive and capable of performing would have wanted to invest in. What we saw today is that player piano rolls are not just about its audio playback through player pianos or other forms of current day media outputs, but they are also visual guides to a cult, a practice, and the music itself. So, to end, let's take a moment to enjoy hearing and seeing what Eugene Goosen have left us on his audiographic roll.